Your agency will be separating children from their parents. And
No,
I would
what we'll be doing is prosecuting parents who've broken the law, just as we do every day in the United States of America.
I can appreciate that. But if that parent has a 4-year-old child, what do you plan on doing with that child?
The child under law goes to HHS for care and custody.
They will be separated from their parent.
Just
and
like
so my
we do in the
question-
United States every day.
And so the question is, and the request has been, to give us the information about how you are training and what the protocols are for separating a child from their parent.
I'm happy to provide you with the training information.
Thank you.
About a month after that exchange, in which then HHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen claimed the Trump administration was not separating families at the southern border as policy, California Democrat Kamala Harris became the first senator to call for Nielsen to resign, citing, among other things, her record of misleading statements about the Trump administration's separation of migrant children from their parents at the border. And joining me now is 2020 presidential candidate Senator Kamala Harris of California. Senator, great to have you. Well, you asked for this back in May, or I guess June of 2018, and you got it today. But I'm curious how you're feeling on the day that she actually lost her job.
Well, listen, I called for her resignation. I still believe that she should not be in that position, and obviously she's not there anymore. But, Chris, it's really important that we understand that this is a policy of the administration's that she implemented and was clearly prepared to do so. But it is the administration's policy, and there's it's not any one person only to blame or to require accountability. It's the entire administration and all of the people that are complicit with this administration's policy, which is about separating children at the border. It's about perpetuating untruths, lies, frankly, around what is the nature of the issue. And it is about really just a political game that this president is playing, inciting fear within people in our country around what is otherwise really a humanitarian issue. And we're going to have to address it on every level. But it's not just about whoever was or will be the next Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. This is about an administration that has failed to project the morals and the values of our country, and instead is engaged in political gamesmanship around an issue that is having real consequence for very vulnerable people.
I want to talk about how to address it, because you said we're going to have to address it, but just as a sort of follow-up question, I mean, Nielsen, according to reporting, was essentially fired because she was not willing to facially break the law. The president was ordering to do things that would be in violation of the law. He got rid of her. There's an anticipation that the president will push for that. And I guess the question, as a lawyer yourself, as a former attorney general and prosecutor, how do you think about what to do if and when the moment comes when they do just attempt to facially violate the law?
Well, there needs to be consequence. Obviously, first of all, the courts are acting and kicking in terms of the constitutionality of these various policies from the administration. There needs to be also some consequence and accountability exerted by the United States Congress. I am truly hoping that my Republican colleagues will agree that we cannot continue to have policies coming through that department that are really violating people's human rights. When we talk about the issue of asylum, we are talking about people fleeing murder capitals of the world, and we are prepared, according to this administration, to turn our backs on those who are seeking help and refuge. You look at the lies that are being perpetuated and the misdirection of priorities. This visit that the administration paid down to Calexico, Chris, I've been to Calexico, California, and let me tell you something. They're talking about building this fence that he's calling a wall, which is a vanity project. Can I tell you, when I went to Calexico, what I saw were tunnels. So how are they going to deal with the tunnels, with the fence or the wall or whatever they're calling it? It's just, it is a complete distraction from what needs to be productive approach and good public policy around an issue, including the fact that part of what we need to do, if we want to focus on prevention, if we think about it short-term and long-term, is the humanitarian aid and the aid that we were giving the Northern Triangle. This administration has now cut off. That's aid that has many purposes, including focusing on the potential for economic development in those countries, aid that has as a focus and a potential focus reduction of corruption in those countries. But we're cutting that off and rejecting and turning our backs on people who are fleeing. It doesn't seem to have any logic, in addition to being a humanitarian crisis.
So when you talk about the aid, and that is 100% true, we have reduced every year, I think, of the Trump administration aid to those three countries, El Salvador,
Right.
Honduras, and Guatemala, in the Northern Triangle.
Right.
If you were president right now, let's say, or were president in the future when something like this presented itself, because it does seem the administration's rhetoric aside, the numbers are going up, and there is a genuine capacity issue in terms of the current bureaucracy's ability to deal humanely with families and young children. What should be done? What is the program that you would like to see pursued here?
Well, it's a multi-pronged approach that is required. So it is both about reinstituting that aid so we can deal with the long-term effects of the crisis and hopefully mitigate or reduce them, and which is the reason that people are fleeing these countries. Through aid, we can potentially reduce the reason that they have to flee. There is short-term what we need to do, which is to have a robust approach to processing asylum claims, so that we give people a meaningful process by which they can tell their stories and describe the harm they're fleeing. We should talk about also this policy that they put in place to say that the people should be processed in Mexico. Well, many of them have also experienced harm through the travels through Mexico, but yet we're turning our back and saying, go back to Mexico while we're processing your cases. And that's misinformed and misdirected as a policy. So there are many things that must be done that are both around prevention in the long term, but also addressing the current issue, which is a humanitarian issue and requires a humanitarian response. That's not what we've seen. We've seen an administration that is engaged in a very punitive approach to people who are vulnerable and are seeking help from us as a country. This is not reflective of who we are or who we should be as a country who has said that we will accept and receive those who are fleeing harm.
The administration contends, and I understand why there's reason to be skeptical, they're good faith, but their contention is not that it's punitive, but rather it's deterrence, right? That essentially they are attempting to send a signal down the line to the Northern Triangle, you cannot do this. What do you think about the logic of deterrence generally in this kind of situation?
People are fleeing homicides, murders. People are fleeing circumstances that present greater harm to them than what they're experiencing when they come to the border. It's wrong. They're wrong to say this. It's just actually, there will be no deterrent equal to the deterrent that is to stay in a country where they might be killed. That's the biggest deterrent on the map right now. And so they are fleeing those places, hoping that they can have a meaningful process by which they can receive some kind of refuge and safety, and we ought to give it to them.
All right. Senator Kamala Harris, thank you so much for making the time. Come back again. We'd love to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.